Good evening, everyone. Tonight we're speaking with a friend of mine and that I have known since I was in Denver. His name is Simon Maghakyan. I'm sorry again for Maghakyan. Is it right?
Yeah, in Armenian it's Simon Maghakyan. In English,
Maghakyan.
Simon Maghakyan.
Maghakyan. So I'm sorry for this. Even I lived in Georgia for a year, I still struggle with pronouncing Georgian names. It's the same with my name also. You cannot pronounce it very well. Maybe you can because you're Russian. So Simon is a human rights defender and an activist, Armenian-American, who worked with the many organizations. He currently works also with the ANCA, the biggest Armenian-American organization in the United States. He is also a researcher, a lecturer in Denver. He lectures political sciences at the moment, and he did really interesting research on the neglection, and not just neglection, but the what is the English word? This destruction of the Armenian cultural heritage in Turkey and Azerbaijan, specifically in Nakhchivan region of Azerbaijan, as I recall well. I invited Simon in this, let's call it, edition of Leadership Talks that is focused on Nagorno Karabakh conflict. We spoke with Rauf Mammadov from the Middle East Institute last week, who's an Azerbaijani-American, and Simon was the first one I called, but we already managed. We only managed now to speak tonight. Simon, good evening, and thank you for spending some time, taking some time aside to speak with us tonight.
Hi, Lubo. Thank you for the invitation. I am glad to see that, at least the people of Montenegro and the Balkans are interested in this topic, because one problem has been, the world being overwhelmed with the COVID pandemic and the United States presidential election. So it's not getting the coverage that it deserves, with the hope of getting enough international support to stop the fighting and find some peaceful solution to what's going on. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you, and through you communicate with the English-speaking communities in Montenegro and others throughout the Balkans.
As you know, the reason why I'm calling you, and I thought that it might be interesting for people in our region, is that we just as we talked before this conversation, that our two regions share the same tragic destiny of perpetual conflicts between different ethnicities and nationalities. That we're also part of a communist federation, and that we pretty much dramatically and tragically went out of this historical experiment. Almost 140,000 people lost their lives during the 90s. And people in our region, and mostly globally, tend to think that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was not so dramatical as it was in the Balkans. But when it comes to Caucasus, that's completely not true. Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and most notably the Nagorno Karabakh conflict was the one that had many victims, many displaced people. It was, if not even worse than the one in the Balkans. There was, during my conversation with Mr. Mammadov last week, he said that maybe because of the conflict in the 90s in Yugoslavia, that was taking too much attention of the Western public, because we were closer geographically to them. People didn't recognize the extent of the destruction that was happening in the South Caucasus. Simon, the first question is, according to your information, you have family there. What is happening at the moment in the Nagorno Karabakh region?
So starting September 27th, it will be 3 weeks in just a couple of days. Azerbaijan's military, with air support from the military of Turkey, unleashed an aggression on, the internationally unrecognized Armenian Republic of Artsakh or Nagorno Karabakh, with the aim of what they consider liberating their territories that they were part of Soviet Azerbaijan. And the war has been going on ever since. There is a ceasefire that Moscow brokered that was supposed to be for humanitarian purposes that effectively did not take place, and that reportedly happened after Turkey's prime minister basically called Baku and gave the green light to continue the fighting. So since September 27, very heavy fighting on the entire line of contact. So you have two areas where the fighting has been most severe. It's the northeast area of Nagorno Karabakh, the region of the villages of and towns of Talish and Mataris. It looks like Azerbaijan had some success there in the beginning, but was forced to retrieve. But the most vulnerable area for self-defense is the southeast area, which are mainly plains. It's not a mountainous area. That's the region of Fizuli and Jebrail, and it looks like most of the heavy fighting has been going on there because Azerbaijan can see being successful, and they have taken some territory in that area, and they're trying to go uphill to the town of Hadrut. And Azerbaijan's president, by the way, all the information is shut down in Azerbaijan, no social media, so everything comes from one source. And the authoritarian president, whose family has ruled the country with some interruptions since 1969, even when it was part of the Soviet Union, the president declared that they had taken Hadrut, the Armenian town. It was not true, and so now they are trying to make sure that he is able to prove himself to be right, and so a lot of the heavy fighting is happening in that area. But it's not really the heavy fighting that is causing the humanitarian disaster. It's the nonstop bombing and shelling of civilian areas. So almost nonstop, the largest settlements in Karabakh, the capital Stepanakert and the nearby town of Shushi, they have been receiving bombs from Azerbaijan and Turkey. Amnesty International reported the use of Israeli-made cluster bombs that are dangerous for civilians because they have small ammunitions that have red ribbons on them. So if children find them and think it's a toy and they pull it out, it blows up. There was, of course, also civilian casualties on Azerbaijani side. There was a bomb dropped on the second largest city in Azerbaijan, Ganja, that also resulted in civilian casualties. So several, maybe 1 or 3 bombs were dropped on Ganja, probably by mistake by the Armenian side as they were trying to neutralize the Turkish air command that has F-16 fighters there. But at the same time, the real humanitarian disaster is happening in Azerbaijan's nonstop bombardment. Over 600 reported, cluster bombs and war crime weapons have been dropped on the civilian population. And as you have probably seen in the news, there was also a deliberate precision airstrike on one of the most iconic Armenian cathedrals in the region, not just once, but twice. So it was not an accident. It was a deliberate targeting of a sacred site that Azerbaijan is infamous for having done in the past as well. So it's a real disaster right now. Soldiers dying on both sides. Of course, Azerbaijan soldiers include terrorist mercenaries from northern Syria, about 1,400 of them, or 1,500. There are different numbers of how many there are. Civilians have suffered in both the Armenian and Azerbaijani side, probably a total of 100, although I've not looked at the real, at the most recent numbers yet, have been killed. Among soldiers, Armenia has confirmed 633 fallen soldiers. And some believe the number is much higher because that humanitarian ceasefire was never in place, so they were not able to retrieve bodies for confirmation. And Azerbaijan is refusing to release the number of its fallen soldiers and the mercenaries.
Understand. Second question is that unfortunately people are getting used to this in our regions. So this is only the last, let's say, iteration of the perpetual conflicts. That this is a conflict that has been in place since at least 100 years. So since the October Revolution in the Imperial Russia, and before that the wars with the Persia. And if you know a little bit history of the region, you know that this is only just as it has been known here in the Balkans. This is only a continuation of one long war and hostilities between different ethnicities. There are many similarities between two regions. And people here tend to, maybe predominantly on social networks, to take sides based on religion. So you can see that people from Serbia predominantly take Armenian side because they believe that the Christians are in danger, and Bosniaks, which are Muslims, are taking predominantly Azerbaijani sides, even though that two confessions of Islam that are not, predominantly Azerbaijani population is Shia. Here are Sunni Muslims mostly, and Orthodox Church of Serbia, and is not in communion with Armenia, and you can see a lot of differences theologically. But people tend to perceive this conflict in Nagorno Karabakh as a religious conflict, when in fact, according to my belief, this is an ethnic territorial conflict that has been in place. Religion certainly plays a role, but mostly when you read the narrative, it is a conflict between two ethnicities that had been living together for centuries. Armenians tend to perceive themselves as an autochthonous nation of the Caucasus, just as Albanians do in the Balkans. But still, Azerbaijanis have been living there for at least 1,000 years. So in American, when you speak to an American about this, about so much history, they could not understand that, but we can from the Balkans. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think, why there haven't been too much dialogue between the two sides, between not the countries, not the states, which as you mentioned has its problems, those political systems are complicated in the region, but among the activists, among the general population, what could have been done? Do you have any examples of an attempt to create meaningful dialogue between Armenians as people and Azerbaijanis? And if you have some example, it would be great if you can share it with us.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in every conflict, citizen diplomacy plays a huge role, and we have not seen any institutional manifestations of citizen diplomacy in the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict. There were more attempts earlier. I remember after the first war, the first Karabakh war, which ended with the 1994 ceasefire, on Armenia's public television, back when I used to, live in my ancestral homeland, they would have lives with Azerbaijan. So you would have one day a group of intellectuals discuss the conflict. Another day you would have cultural representatives. So there was, citizen diplomacy. Of course, there were disagreements. Of course, there were mutually exclusive narratives that were taking place, but at least there was some line of communication. And unfortunately, as the longer the country started not finding a peaceful resolution, the rhetoric definitely became stronger on both sides. But we have to, I am very well known for my acknowledgement of the both sides, when there's casualties, when there's tragedy, but we can't pretend that we're talking about symmetrical powers. Just like today, we have a population of 3 million Armenians combined in Armenia and Nagorno Karabakh fighting Azerbaijan and Turkey that together have a population of 92 million. And they not only have motivation, but also ability to wipe out the Armenian homeland, assuming Russia does not fulfill its contractual obligations to protect the existence of Armenia, which it so far seems not to be doing. Similarly, there has been an asymmetrical relationship in those conversations, because while until recently Armenia was not a full democracy, Azerbaijan has always been a dictatorship. It's a top-down control of all media outlets, of all civic society groups, where any dissent, any criticism, any engagement is seen as challenging the power of the Aliyev regime. And that has made it extremely hard to have any sort of citizen diplomacy. And Azerbaijan's government has been using the conflict with Armenia as an excuse for all the problems that exist in Azerbaijan. It's one of the richest countries in the world in terms of its oil revenues, and yet at the same time, it's one of the poorest countries in the world. Average Azerbaijani lives in poverty. In fact, average Armenian also, is poor, is not rich, but Armenia being landlocked and being blockaded by both Azerbaijan and Turkey, an average Armenian has had a, better life than Azerbaijanis. So we're talking about people who have been oppressed, who have not had opportunities to engage. And I have been, a part of some efforts to have dialogue. For example, in July, there was another fighting, a much more limited one, between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And unfortunately, we saw conflicts emerge in diasporic communities around the world that were most likely top-down orders from Azerbaijan's government to export the violence against Armenian diasporas for the purpose of creating some sort of sympathy for the Azerbaijani cause. And the reason why I would blame the Azerbaijani government on this, because it's not happening in Russia right now. And the first thing that Russia did after this new war started was to call the Azerbaijani ambassador and say that you're not going to have, riots against Armenians in Moscow. So they were able to prevent that. So after that happened, I actually co-initiated with 2 Azerbaijani researchers and human rights activists, and another Armenian researcher and human rights activist. We initiated something called Words, Not Swords, which was an encouragement to Azerbaijanis and Armenians across the world to engage in peaceful dialogue, to disagree, to debate, but never retort to violence. And, that was not necessarily a popular thing to do. I did not get a lot of support from, the Armenian diaspora, but a lot of intellectuals proactively joined that statement. And we had to be very delicate about it, right? We had to recognize the fact that my Azerbaijani human rights colleagues and me, we may disagree with each other. We have different ideas of the reasons for the conflict, the origins of the conflict, but it shouldn't stop us from pursuing peaceful mechanism. And I hope a lot of people right now, realize that maybe there should have been more effort placed in finding a peaceful solution, because you have young people dying en masse on both sides. And that's just like losing an entire generation in both countries. And how are you going to overcome that pain? How are you going to compensate for that? It's going to take another 30 years for people to, you know, be able to breathe again, assuming things end soon, right? We don't know where this is heading. So it is tough, and we haven't had enough efforts, but people like me, who are probably fewer right now because of the rhetoric that exists, are still ready to engage with on the citizen diplomacy level. But that's not going to stop me from calling out, you know, the dictatorships of both Turkey and Azerbaijan. Of what I see is to aim not just to retrieve territory that Azerbaijan owned during the Soviet era, but really accomplish the goal of pan-Turkism, which is to eliminate Armenians from their indigenous homeland, which started, you know, from when we were first conquered and colonized. As you said earlier, you know, Azerbaijani Turks have lived in the area long enough, right? It's not a, you know, white settler versus Native American narrative where people arrived in ships 500 years ago. But there were invasions of the Armenian homeland. And we found a way to coexist while being oppressed, while being colonized. You know, my family lived in the Ottoman Empire. We were loyal citizens, and that didn't stop Ottoman Turkey from committing a genocide against my family, even though my great-grandfather served in the Ottoman army. And Armenians truly have that sense of vulnerability and existential fear. And that's why, you know, some people may be reading my posts and think that I'm overreacting. But if someone has done the research that I have and exposed what Azerbaijan has done, the government of Azerbaijan has done to the Armenian heritage, as you mentioned in Nakhichevan, the existential fear is very well founded. And Azerbaijan and Turkey not only have willingness to wipe out Armenians, they also have ability. And that's a huge differentiation, right? You could say maybe some Armenian nationalists have the same willingness. That might be true, but Armenians have no ability of wiping out, you know, the neighbors who have colonized us and who now we live with, and we have to live with. No one is moving, right? We have to find a way to coexist. We have to find a way to respect each other's culture, and we have to fear war. And I think Azerbaijan has not been fearing war because they have been pushing this propaganda that Azerbaijan is all powerful. You know, they're spending all this money on weapons, and they are extremely powerful with their weaponry. But more powerful than that is the Armenian motivation to survive. And if this drags on, Armenians will have to somehow win, because I don't see how we would want to allow for the wipeout of the Armenian homeland after 3,000 years of struggling to survive and live. Again, not to say that Azerbaijani civilians are not receiving Armenian bombs, that there are no casualties, are not being victimized. That's not the issue. But we have to acknowledge the asymmetrical difference.
This was my question. Yeah, considering taking into account the asymmetrical nature of the conflict, just as you said, and the trauma. When I speak with my Azerbaijani counterparts on this specific matter, I always mentioned about the collective historical trauma Armenian people have, and their, let's say, natural distrust in the intentions of their neighbors, Azerbaijanis and Turkey. I always ask them, have any of the Azerbaijani or Turkish leaders ever did something to regain that trust? or to show their willingness that the ethnic cleansing will not be repeated. On the same, on the let's say on the, I just wanted to ask you in the same manner about the Azerbaijani people that have lost their homes. We spoke about the south, and you mentioned it, which is honest from your side. But when you look at the completely southern part of the Nagorno Karabakh region and outside of it on this valley down to the south, when you look at the town of Jibrail and the rest of the towns that were on the border with Iran, you only see, just like here in Bosnia or on both sides, all these houses, the complete towns that are without roofs, like just houses that were completely empty, that Armenians haven't populated. The Armenians haven't settled there after the war in 1990s. Have Armenian side leaders, I'm talking about leaders, you talked about citizenship diplomacy, citizens diplomacy, but have any Armenian leader, has any Armenian leader ever discussed or trying to mention this subject of displaced Azerbaijanis in the region, people that have suffered also, that are living throughout Azerbaijan now, generations, people who are born there maybe and at the same time where you and I were born and have been living all their life out of their ancestral homes. So what do you think about that? Do you know any example of Armenian leader trying to make relation of trust between the two sides?
I think there's two things to say about it, and I'll go in detail. One is the acknowledgement of the mutual suffering in the conflict that has not taken place on either side. And of course, we could say that Armenia, as the winning side of the first war, should have done more to acknowledge the suffering of Azerbaijanis. That's the refugee and the IDP population question, and I want to talk more about that in detail. And the second part of it is the negotiations that have been happening throughout these years. And the format of the negotiations have always assumed that Azerbaijan would regain many of those buffer territories around the Soviet era borders of Artsakh or Nagorno Karabakh. So Armenia has never said they're indefinitely going to keep all of that land. The question for negotiations has been is, okay, how can we guarantee the survival of Nagorno Karabakh in a peaceful settlement? In other words, if you're going to get those lands back, Azerbaijan, are you guaranteeing recognition of Nagorno Karabakh either as an independent state or as unification with Armenia? And Azerbaijan basically has said, no, we want all of it back. And so you have, and in rhetoric, it may sound like Armenia wants to keep everything and Azerbaijan wants to have everything back. But in truth, the negotiations have been around, what the return of some of that land would look like and what would Armenians get in exchange. And where things were heading, Armenians were getting nothing in exchange, which would bring us back to point zero. And this is what happened. So after, Soviet Union takes over the area, and Russia, as you mentioned earlier, was already the empire that owned the area until the October Revolution. So Soviets come back, Russia comes back, and they decide that they need to give, there were three competing or contested territories. Nakhichevan, Zangezur, and Karabakh. Zangezur was, and there were, historically Armenian territories that had been conquered and colonized through the centuries by different ethnic groups. Azerbaijanis ended up inheriting, a lot of the conquests and sort of emerging out of the different groups that have come in as the other group other than Armenians. but there were mixed communities living in those lands. Zangezur stayed within Armenia, but Nakhichevan, under Turkish pressure, went to Azerbaijan, even though half of the population was Armenian. And then Karabakh, even though the majority of the population was Armenian, went to Azerbaijan. And through the Soviet era, Soviet Azerbaijan compelled the Armenian community of Nakhichevan, the indigenous people of that land, to leave. So by the 1980s, there were no Armenians remaining there. So it was a slow motion ethnic cleansing that took place. And the Armenians in Nagorno Karabakh saw that and they were terrified. They thought that was, you know, their fate, that they were also going to become a minority in their own homeland, and then they would be wiped out just like Armenians in Nakhichevan were. So when the Soviet constitution allowed for referenda, when it allowed to make local decisions, the autonomous region of Nagorno-Karabakh voted to become independent of not the Soviet Union, but of Soviet Azerbaijan, right? And so instead of trying to accommodate the situation, Soviet Azerbaijan convinced Moscow to start an ethnic cleansing operation in the Shahumyan province, which is currently under Azerbaijani occupation. It's not part of Karabakh, it's not under Armenian control. So they started the Operation Ring with the KGB and with Azerbaijani forces. They ethnically cleansed the area. They tried the same thing in Hadrut in the south eastern area. And Armenians saw no other solution but to take arms to defend themselves, so that they got to stay in their homes. And of course, Armenian volunteers from Armenia helped, and it became a war. So you have this island, Armenian island within Azerbaijan, that was trying to survive. And a former Armenian town that had been cleansed of its Armenian population in 1920, Shushi, or Azerbaijans call it Shusha, Azerbaijan kept using the Armenian church that was bombarded last week. They used the location of the Armenian church to have grenades launched against Stepanakert, the largest Armenian town, for months, hoping that Armenians would attack their own church, basically, to stop that. And instead, Armenians organized and attacked Shushi, and as Armenians would call it, liberated that. And after taking Shushi, the Armenian forces, whether it was a good idea or not, felt that the only way to stop the war was to secure a buffer zone to eliminate the island status of Nagorno-Karabakh, to make sure that it, you know, had a common border with Armenia. And that's how those other regions were taken by the Armenian side. And that's how the large Azerbaijani refugee population was created. Now, Azerbaijan forgets to mention that there is a very large Armenian refugee population from the rest of Azerbaijan, from the Shahumyan region, from Baku, from Sumgait, where the anti-Armenian pogroms took place, from Nakhichevan. And for some reason, because you know, the Azerbaijanis who left the territories are internationally, the surrounding territories, the international community considers occupied. For some reason, you know, Azerbaijan feels that the IDPs or the refugees from those areas have more rights to return than the Armenians of Shahumyan, Armenians of Nakhichevan, Armenians of Baku, Armenians of Sumgait. And they have been using, you know, ridiculously high numbers for the refugees that actually combine all of the refugees together, but Azerbaijan says they're all Azerbaijani refugees and neglects, you know, the Armenian refugees. And the worst part of that is, for many years, the authoritarian regime in Azerbaijan would actually use the presence of Azerbaijani refugees on its territory to create photo ops for international sympathy. So instead of using the money Azerbaijan was earning, you know, from gas revenues, from oil revenues, to house the refugees, they would force them to live in camps, in tents, until recently. to the point where Amnesty International and other human rights organizations called out Azerbaijan for basically forcing their own refugees to live in tents, so that there would be more sympathy for them and there would be more hatred for Armenians. So it's a humanitarian disaster. You're right, the Armenian government should have done more to acknowledge the suffering of the Azerbaijani refugees who had to flee their homes. At the same time, on the negotiating table, Armenia has been willing, not only willing, but ready to return those territories, but in exchange for a security guarantee for the existence of the Armenian population of Artsakh. And Azerbaijan has said, no, we will let them have autonomy within Azerbaijan, which is, as I said earlier, going back to point zero, where Armenians were in autonomy with Azerbaijan. And when they asked to have Armenian schools and Armenian churches opened, Azerbaijan started committing pogroms against them in Shahumyan and in other places.
As I was saying, here in the Balkans, we experienced a terrible war, which took 140,000 lives. We had a war in Croatia between Serbs and Croatians. Serbs were living there for 6 or 7 centuries since the Ottoman times. They suffered genocide during the World War II. And then they decided this time they will not allow it. That was the propaganda. And then they created a autonomous region within Croatia, which was defended by the Serbian, which was heavily supported by the Serbian state and the Yugoslav People's Army, which was controlled by the Serbian government. The same happened in Bosnia, only in Bosnia, this is a frozen conflict. In Croatia. Croatia in 1995 liberated its territories, and almost, I'm not sure now, but 200 to 400 Serbs fled Croatia and are up to these days living in Serbia. In Bosnia, you have internally displaced people. Montenegro participated in the war attacking Croatia, etc. We have Kosovo at the end, and it would continue up to this day if there was no direct involvement from the international community. What do you think? NATO involved directly, militarily, with the intervention, and personally my family suffered at the time, but this intervention took up around 1,000 to 2,000 lives, but it ended the wars. So NATO entered the region militarily with its base in Kosovo, in Bosnia, and since then there haven't been problems, even though Bosnia still has a disputed regions. They have a system that's not functioning, a federation that's not federation, 3 presidents, and it's completely crazy. We have Kosovo, which has been recognized, its independence has been recognized. So do you think that this regional, I'm coming to a question when I'm asking, do you think that Russia's involvement, even though it declaratively supports...
I've lost you. You're frozen. I cannot hear you.
Okay.
I cannot see you.
I hear you well. Do you hear me now, Beck?
I hear you now.
Okay, we're gonna pretend that it hasn't happened. So I came to the point that even Russia declaratively supports and protects Armenian independence. It has a huge base in Gyumri on the border, Turkish border. I was there 2 years ago in the region. So do you think that actually, if instead of Russia, you had NATO more present in the region and United States and the West, this conflict could be solved in an easier way, or it would be mitigated, or does Russian presence, even though it's in general and in words protects Armenian independence, does it make problems at the same time?
So, I mean, right now, for the Armenian side, the issue is existence and survival. And, of course, you could argue theoretically that Armenian overdependence on Russia makes Armenia less sovereign and all of that. But, the realpolitik is showing that, no country is fully independent. No country is, fully sovereign. There is a lot of interdependence, and this is Russia's backyard. You can tell from, European and American statements, they expect Russia to solve the problem, that, no one, really wants to deal with the situation. Yesterday, the U.S. Secretary of State Pompeo said, we hope Armenians will be able to defend against what the Azerbaijanis are doing, which was very disappointing for those who were hoping that the United States would try to play a positive role and maybe trying to pressure Turkey into stopping, the gaslighting of the situation. Certainly, I've heard views that if the humanitarian catastrophe endures, in other words, if Azerbaijan keeps bombing the civilian areas with war crime cluster bombs, which has already resulted in the evacuation of half of Nagorno Karabakh's population. So now you have, a massive refugee crisis that's not being reported because that is not the priority at the second. But, these are refugees who have come to the southern part of Armenia or to Armenia's largest city of Yerevan, the capital. If this humanitarian crisis endures, and if, God forbid, Azerbaijan is militarily successful and along with Turkey moves on to wipe out Armenia, and for some reason Russia, does not move forward with its contractual obligations, I have, heard, certain people hoping that NATO will act responsibly and try to contain the bloodshed through aerial intervention, like it happened for Kosovo in the 90s, as you were mentioning. But I'm hoping that things will not get to that. I'm hoping that, Russia will finally take on the challenge that Turkey is presenting to it right now, right? And because this is the first time Turkey is openly approaching Russia's borders after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and even since World War I. So hopefully, Russia will decide that it's not acceptable to have one of its military allies to be the receiving end of aggression from two countries who are much more powerful and willing and able to to commit mass atrocities. But God forbid things get out, even more out of hand. Hopefully NATO will find the moral ground to interfere. I hear, in the United States, among government and opposition circles, both among Republicans and Democrats, whispering that maybe Turkey should be held accountable, and not only through sanctions, but also being kicked out of NATO. And as you know, that can also escalate, because the neo-Ottoman flirtations that Turkey is doing, involvement in Iraq, Syria, Libya, and now, in the Caucasus, who knows what's going to happen? I mean, if you talk to some Turkish activists who've been persecuted by the Erdogan regime, some call him the Turkish Hitler, and are warning that, if he's not contained, we may be looking at a catastrophic scenario, not just for the region, but for the whole world. Hopefully things will not get to that point. Hopefully Russia will be able to flex its muscles and meet its contractual obligations toward Armenia. But, NATO probably should be looking at different scenarios of containing its own member Turkey's threat, which may sound counterintuitive right now, but certainly there is a lot of concern from Turkish activists who are prosecuted by Erdogan and others in the region of where Erdogan will stop if he's not stopped right now.
The last question is related to the future. You live in the United States. Your destiny is connected to the. You have built your life there. There are many Armenians living in diaspora, and it's the same for us. We have huge diaspora. People from the Balkans have huge diasporas all over the world, and you have these conflicts moving from just as you mentioned that you had riots and protests around the world, and people are fighting their wars even in Australia or in the streets of Chicago, for example, during our conflicts. But I want to talk about the people living there. So if you have a vision of a mutual future coexistence between the two nations and solution for the conflicts, it's a very complicated answer, I know, but what would be the message? What would be the solution? What would be your vision? It can be a utopia of a kind, but if you want to share a positive message and believe that this conflict can have a solution that could benefit both sides and feel and make both sides feel not as winners, but not as losers at the end of the day. So what it would be, Simon?
Well, first of all, this carnage, this war must end. That's the number one. And whatever intervention that takes at this point, it's probably appropriate, whether it's Russia, which is the most likely to intervene, or another world coalition. It has to stop first and foremost. Secondly, I think both societies have to realize that there is no such thing as winning a war, because regardless of territorial gains you make, your societies are haunted by the repercussions of losing an entire generation to war, both physically and emotionally. And I think a lot of work needs to be done on the citizen diplomacy level to have that message delivered. And lastly, Armenians and Azerbaijanis have to love what we have more than have strong feelings about the enemy. So in other words, we have to start hating war. When we hear of war, we have to imagine everything that we love and how that could be lost, and be willing to have mutual concessions, to compromise, and understand that a compromise to this conflict on a peaceful table, it's not going to leave any side completely happy. Compromise means some loss, but a loss that is much smaller compared to what other wars could bring to both sides, regardless what the outcome in terms of territorial gains of that war is. And so, I'm hoping there will be a lot of soul searching, and that in terms of the Armenian diaspora will play a constructive role in standing by Armenia's government, if and when it does say yes, and it has been saying, we are willing to compromise, we are willing to make concessions, but we have to have guarantee for Armenian existence in Artsakh, in Nagorno Karabakh, and having that population live under the regime in Azerbaijan is unfortunately out of question. Not only because of what Azerbaijan is doing right now to that very population it claims to it claims as its own citizens, but also what Azerbaijan has done in the past 20 years. As you mentioned in the beginning of the program, my research, which was published last year, looked at the Armenian cultural heritage that was left in Nakhichevan, another formerly Armenian region, under Azerbaijan's control. Between 1997 and 2006, the entire Armenian heritage of that region that constituted 89 medieval houses of worship, 5,840 historical crossstones, and 22,000 or more tombstones that were not in a way of development, were not in a way of anything. They were systematically wiped out from the face of the earth in a way that has not happened anywhere, in at least in our memory, anywhere in the world. And Azerbaijan not only denies that it destroyed those monuments, it says those monuments never existed to begin with. And that's the genocidal intent that Armenians are concerned with. And having that intent backed up with ability that comes from Turkey, that's a serious concern. It's not just an Armenian perception of vulnerability. It's a real Armenian fear for erasure, and that's why it's not it's not going to it's going to require a real negotiated settlement of the conflict. It's not going to get solved on the battlefield, because if Azerbaijan keeps succeeding, it's going to go further west until all of Armenia is destroyed. And if Armenia succeeds on the table, there will be some sort of peace, but the Armenian diaspora and myself need to be ready to stand there and say, our young people, both Armenian and Azerbaijani, their lives are more important than another war. And we need to make a compromise solution to this. That's not going to make both sides completely happy, but it's going to be something that's better than another war. So we have to make sure on both sides that there is no other war and that we can, coexist together, because there's no other solution. We have to find a way.
Thank you again. As I was telling before, thank you again. You shared some time to speak and share your point of view, especially in this emotionally charged period for you and the other people from both countries. It is important for us here in the region that have suffered significantly to hear people speaking about the war while the war is happening on the ground. I wish personally that peace comes to the region, and peace will come to the region, and that conflict will be solved at the negotiating table. Then the suffering of the people will stop eventually. Thank you again, and I hope to see you soon and speak with you about some other topics that are not war related. Have a great day, and in regards to you and your family.
Thank you, Lubo. Appreciate it.